Wholeness, welcome. This is Josh Tippold of Integrating Presence, and today I've got Phyllis Levitt with me. Phyllis, what's going on today?
Well, I'm just really excited to talk with you and very, grateful to have that you have me on your show because I am a psychotherapist of over 30 years, and I recently wrote a book called America in Therapy: A New Approach to Hope and Healing for a Nation in Crisis. Because I think our collective mental health is probably the biggest missing piece in political, social, cultural conversation for healing today.
Well, it really is huge. That's right. Before we get into that, who is Phyllis and what kind of work does she do?
Yeah. Well, as I said, I've been a psychotherapist for over 30, actually 34 years, and I just recently retired and I'm totally focused on writing. My background is I grew up on the East Coast in the United States in a kind of, suburban setting. And I had a lot of early childhood trauma that I had buried and forgotten, and it really colored my life until I began to start to have some memories as an adult. I had been in a lot of meditation, spiritual practices, and at a certain point, I realized that I needed something in addition to that because it wasn't what I wasn't able to really progress in that because there was just so much unresolved internal pain, and I ended up going to therapy, and that was at a time when most people really didn't go to therapy, and it was sort of looked at as something like a sign of weakness, or you can't make it on your own, or why do you need to talk to anybody, or put the past behind you, or that kind of thing. But a couple of my friends had started to go to therapy, and it really was life changing for me. I began to remember what happened to me, and I began to really work deeply with the after effects of childhood trauma, and that had me decide to become a therapist. And so, um, I worked with children initially, and then I worked with families and adults and individuals and couples. And I was really privy to so much emotional, physical, and sexual abuse and neglect in our country today. Ordinary people who go to work and look like they're functioning well, actually carrying, like myself, carrying around a lot of pain and a lot of unresolved behavioral and emotional issues, and finding themselves not really thriving in life or making the same decisions and relationship patterns over and over again that were dysfunctional. And then it really just occurred to me at somewhere along the line that all groups operate on family dynamics. And to the extent that a school or a business or a community or even a nation operates on healthy family dynamics of cooperation and respect and good boundaries and love and providing for each other, and in particular also peaceful conflict resolution skills when there's disagreement or hurt or anger. To the extent that we operate on those principles, great. And to the extent that we don't, and sometimes very severely, as I mentioned in my practice, I saw a lot of abuse and neglect. Um, then we operate as communities and as a nation on the principles of an abusive or dysfunctional family. And I just really felt like I needed to write about that because part of it's understanding why we are subject to so much escalating violence and hatred and discrimination and injustice. What are the psychological roots of that? Just as we look for that in the individual or the individual family. And what does psychotherapy and psychology have to offer that can help us heal? Because that's why people come to therapy, is to heal. So I wanted to bring that healing conversation to a larger arena.
Well, beautiful. Yeah, there's so much in there that you said to start off with. I mean, it was kind of different for me. I did a stint in therapy, and I found it really helpful. I think it would have been even more helpful if I would have gotten into it for better reasons, but I won't go into that now. But it was actually kind of the opposite, where my spiritual practice was bringing up all this material, and both are common, right? There's people that are
Right.
in spiritual practice where none of that comes up, and therapy is a huge breakthrough. And then there's other people like me where, like, wow, all this stuff is coming up that I had forgotten about or that I didn't address properly, and next thing I know, I'm seeing I couldn't see how I was behaving towards myself and others. I was calling up people asking for forgiveness and stuff like this. So a lot of stuff was coming up on my own. And yes, yeah, it does help, of course, to have a very skilled, wise, heartfelt practitioner to go through this. And like I say, the therapy that I did, I found it really helpful. And I would agree too that there are still all these stereotypes and cliches that I don't need therapy. I'm not, nothing's wrong with me. It's like an accusation, right? Some people
Right.
take it as an accusation or something. They don't really, I guess that is one good thing about a spiritual practice. So a lot of people that are doing spiritual practice can see the benefit, obviously, and don't take it as a personal accusation. But they can use it to benefit their spiritual practice and vice versa. Some spiritual practitioners can actually, I think, maybe go deeper and get more out of therapy as well. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And, this whole notion of trauma, it's so, I think it's one of the biggest things on an individual level. And of course, we are a collection of individuals. If we look at something like a nation state, or, I'm so far behind on this psychological term. The guest I had also mentioned family systems. And I've heard a little bit about internal family systems, which I think is a really interesting
Right.
modality too. But I hadn't even heard of this term family systems other than in that context, which is a really interesting term I find. So, but trauma speaking, like I spoke with a guest who'd gone through some, like, lived through child trafficking. I mean, and we've got even worse than that. So we've got the huge, unimaginable, um, darkest of the dark things that can go on where people are severely traumatized and sometimes, yeah. But then we have even just a human birth. I think is somewhat traumatic. And being human is not easy. All of us are going to experience some form of trauma, even, I think, even with birth. Nobody gets out, or nobody gets to experience a human birth with some kind of, I mean, a human life without some kind of pain too. So there's a huge spectrum here of trauma, and it's of utmost importance. And I just give another quick disclaimer. I'm not trauma informed by, people, please chime in if I'm doing something that's not helpful, and I'm open to learn and to know how to go about this in a proper, helpful, safe way as well, so I'm not causing any kind of triggering or re-traumatization. But it shouldn't come into play too much, because we're going to expand this to more kind of an abstract level, maybe, of America. So how did this tell me a little bit more about how this notion of this book came about, and yeah, what kind of inspired you to write this? And then I guess just dive into the material of it, and
Yeah.
tell people what you're talking about in the book, and what kind of solutions you offer, and what you'd like to see in America.
Yeah. So, I'll start with a little story because it really speaks to what family systems theory and family systems work is about. And I think it will be obvious, but I'll also say how this view could be, you could look at a country through a family systems lens. So, a very classic example of family systems work that happened, it was a real situation that I dealt with a long time ago. A child was referred to me for therapy for wetting the bed, and I believe she was 11 or 12 years old, so she was, too old to be wetting the bed. Right? So her parents were worried, and I brought her to therapy. And usually, what I would do when I saw a child was I would interview the parents first, just to get a history and their sense of what might be troubling their child or what was going on. And they were like, "We don't know." And I said, "How are things at home?" "Fine." Um, so I didn't get any information. They didn't know why she was wetting the bed. And then for the second session, I did something called a family sculpture, and you bring the whole family in, and you have each person just enact a very small scene from family life. And there's no direction. It's not like what's bothering you or what's something you like about your family. There's no direction. It's just pick something that you think of, position each person around the room where you want them, and give each person a line. So the family came in, the parents, the other siblings, and this little girl. And the parents and the siblings went first. and they all did very benign scenes, doing homework, making dinner, feeding the dog, whatever. And the lines were also very benign. I don't remember what they were, and I'm thinking to myself, something's missing from this picture, and I'm wondering what it is. And then the little girl who was the bedwetter went last, and she placed her parents on opposite sides of the room, pointing fingers at each other and screaming at each other about their drug and alcohol use. So without that information about what was going on in the family that was affecting her, you would be completely at a loss to understand what anxiety was causing her to wet the bed, right? So she was called the symptom bearer for the families. In psychological terms, she's called the identified patient. She's the one whose symptom calls for help for the family system that is not functioning well, and she's experiencing the pain of it in a way that her symptoms are the call for help. And that's a whole new lens on looking at a larger community or a nation. Who are the symptom bearers? Who are the people calling for help in our country? They're the people who are dying of addiction, who are committing horrible crimes, who are stealing, who are exploiting, who are trafficking children, who are raping, or, they're the people who they're the most symptomatic. And we live in a very judgmental society where we don't look at those people as symptom bearers of the family pain, the family of America pain. And I think also of like the mass shooters who, so often when people look into their background, they were from broken homes, or they were molested, or there were addicts, giving them drugs at a young age, or they were bullied in school. They were people who were hurting so badly and so angry and so dispossessed that they were acting their rage out on anonymous, uh, vulnerable people like themselves, like they had been. So this whole concept of the most symptomatic among us are actually calling for help to the family system, and I call it the family of America. It could be a business, it could be a school, it could be a state, it could be, a church, it could be anywhere where you see some kind of acting out, some kind of, hurt being perpetrated on people by other people. That's one big piece that I talk about in the book. Um,
So let me jump in here real quick, and
yeah,
I,
please.
I would totally agree, and that's it's such a really interesting perspective, and sheds new light on this too, because yeah, what we do with perpetrators is really important too. You have really
Absolutely.
hardline people that would want to lynch or severely punish, and I don't know, that doesn't seem like the best way either, especially in the light you painted. I am curious though about, and it's not as common as far as I know, thank goodness, is psychopathy though. The ones that are in full knowledge that they're doing what they're doing, and
Hmm.
they pretend that they're innocent basically, to hide, and then they pretend very well, right, that they can have the emotional or the empathy in order to hide. So what do we do with this? Because some would claim that there are quite a few psychopaths in positions of high power,
Absolutely.
and they hide it very well. They don't let on to it very well. Not to
I
mention,
think they don't hide it.
well, actually, you're right. It's coming out more and more, and they don't really even care anymore. That like
Right.
they think you can get away with all kinds of stuff. So yeah, what about addressing this, especially when someone almost seems above the law, almost in
Yeah.
some cases,
Yeah.
and we'll just keep it at that, because there are people that are alleging really really dark other practices which kind of go into the spiritual realm, and that's a whole nother ball game. So I guess we'll just keep it kind of more standard, everyday based
Yeah.
program for now. Yeah.
Well, let me just say two things about that. There are people we don't yet know how to treat. There definitely are. And those people really do need to be restrained because they're a danger. They're really a danger. And we see that playing out. And many of those people are not restrained, especially if they attain positions of great power. So I don't think there's an easy fix for that. There's no wise, psychologically astute or spiritually evolved tribunal that's going to remove that person and put them in a safe place and try to help them recover from whatever is hurting them or not. Um, we don't have that. So sort of that, I believe one of the places we need to start, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote my book, America in Therapy, is with educating ourselves. Because many people really don't know what psychopathology is. They don't know what psychopathy is. They don't know that inside the perpetrator is an unhealed victim. They don't know that we need to really focus on, you know, preventing the cycle of abuse and neglect, which keeps perpetuating the creation of both more perpetrators and more people who feel helpless to stand up to perpetration. And I really go into this in great detail in my book in a way that the layman can understand. This is not a academic book. This is based on personal experience, my experience as a therapist, client case studies, because I really think we need this psychological education desperately if we're going to heal our collective mental health.
Absolutely. This, I guess some people have called it bully, victim, hero archetypes, or the victim victimizer cycles, where just the victim will
Mm-hmm.
become the victimizer and vice versa
Right.
until, as far as I know, it just somebody has to say this is enough and do something different. Yeah. And so how do I guess how, what do we do? It seems more clear on an individual level, for people like me and maybe people listening to this that are, spiritual practitioners, for lack of a better word, that have done inner work, that see the benefit and work more kind of individually or on small group levels. When we talk about something almost as abstract as America, how, I guess, is this scaled up? Do we go into the policymakers? Do we look at it on community levels, on the state level? Is it a culture change? I guess, what are kind of the parameters, boundaries, areas that we need to have a kind of therapeutic intervention, or just voluntary therapy? Or yeah, just tell us more about how it is on a
Well,
more macro scale.
I think we need that intervention on all the levels simultaneously. And that's part of the reason why addressing America as a family system, I think is really helpful because it addresses the macrocosm and the microcosm. So there's the people in positions of power, and there are the institutions of power, and there's the policies and the laws that come out of that. There are the states, there's corporations, there's houses of worship, there's houses of education, there's local communities, and they all need that wisdom and that intervention to realign what they're doing that's actually healing for people, that prevents the cycle of violence and divisiveness and injustice that we're experiencing so profoundly right now. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach. And if we just take the example of the family I said at the beginning, that little girl also needed help. She had internalized the anxiety and the rage going on in her home, and her symptoms were not for nothing. She was really suffering. So she needed help to understand, but she also needed the help of her family to heal. She needed both. And I think we as individuals are the same. So many of us, like you said, we're kind of born into the trauma of separation, from our soul or divine origin. At least that's the way I see it. And we're born into this consciousness of separation, which is our ego consciousness, which is, all about dominating other people and submitting and right and wrong and good and evil and more and less and holy and profane and, all the dualities that we suffer from until we can find our way through, which is really healing the wounds that we have individually and collectively sustained. So I think the answer to your question is all levels. And, my level is sort of an educational piece. Somebody else might be working specifically with the climate or with the justice system or run for Congress or work with cleaning up the water or work with a school bullying program. So, we're all pieces of that puzzle. No one of us is going to do the whole thing. This is a collective effort as well as a collective issue.
It's well put. And I was going to ask, yes, how we do it. And so it would be, I guess, more of a voluntary nature that people seeing the value and benefit in it. Is there a call to, you're doing the call to action in a way. It's just, people, not to come up with excuses because there's really no excuses. People are going to say, well, I have so many responsibilities. I have that,
Right.
this and this and this, but it really is. I mean, what do people really value? What are they going to be leaving future generations in a way too? And I think another thing here to really address, maybe for the understanding part of it, is the root. What would you identify as more of the root too? And is there anything that needs to go on beyond psychology and spirituality too? Maybe, but that's your forte and expertise, and I think
Right.
it's highly neglected as well. But yeah, just how to address that.
Well, I think let me just say this as a root cause because, I've worked with hundreds of people over the years. As I said, I did years of my own inner work. And of course, I will be for the rest of my life because it's not going. But I would say that if you boiled everybody's dysfunction, trauma, inability to thrive and really create the life that they want, or create good relationships, or have the love that they want, or the self expression in the world that they desire, if you go down to the very core of everyone's wound, what I have found, without any exception, is an original injury to love and safe belonging in some form. An injury to love and safe belonging. We come into this world biologically wired for love and belonging. And when there is an injury to that, and for many people, there's no love and safe belonging. And of course they're symptomatic. Of course they're in pain. That essential food for their body, soul, and spirit, and mind and heart is missing, or it's been betrayed, or it's been, inconsistent, or they've gotten terrible messages about who they are and their deservedness. And, we could go on and on. But that's the core. And so if we're going to heal, we have to reintroduce love and safe belonging. And it really is that simple and that complicated.
Yeah, it's really well put. Yeah, let's just go into that right now too, because um, totally, I hear more and more people talk about belonging, and I think there's an obvious sense of that. And I know in my own experience, some of us are desperate for belonging, and to the point that we'll do something we probably shouldn't do in order to belong somewhere, right?
That's right.
And you just look at children too. To get love from their parents, they will do all kinds of things. I know that in my experience, one of the ways I would get my parents' attention in life is to act out and do
Right.
something, because there's a huge emotional, it doesn't really matter if it's negative or positive. It's just that they're putting a lot of energy out right away. And I think it's helpful here to address, safe belonging. That's really important. And but more so, love. Well, we all kind of feel what we know what it means to have love in our lives, but it can also be a very vague thing because I love ice cream, or I love this and I love that, and there's so many different flavors, I guess, of love, and what that means for some. I guess it just kind of cheapens it a little bit to define that, but I think maybe it might need a little bit more clarification on what that means, because I think there's, some of the romantic love can be really detrimental at times, but it can be amazing as well. So yeah, just a little bit more clarification on that. The belonging thing is huge, though, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Well, I think, just to expand on, I call it high tech human relations. And these are the elements of a relatively healthy family because nobody does it perfectly. And I really want to say that. We are, often two steps forward, one step back, or we make a mistake and we try to repair it. But we all come into this, imperfect, and we do our best. But a relatively healthy family operates on the principle of love and safe belonging, but to expand on that, what are some of the elements of that? It means I honor and celebrate diversity. You maybe one child is artistic and another scientific or an athlete, and everybody doesn't have to be the same. I celebrate you for your love of animals, even though I wish you had become a doctor, that kind of thing, or I wanted a doctor in the family. So it's that real acceptance, but also honoring and celebrating of our differences and a desire to bring them together into a healthy whole rather than demand a certain kind of rigid conformity. Okay. Healthy boundaries is another aspect of love and safe belonging, where there's a sense of where I end and you begin, and where you end and I begin, so that there's a sense of a shared space and everybody's needs matter. And they might not all get met, but we do our best to meet some of them, and we don't just pick one person and their needs are going to get met and everybody else suffers. And these are, the opposite of what I'm saying are the characteristics of a neglectful or dysfunctional or abusive family, where only one person has all the power or all the say, or only their needs matter, or their style of dress or religion matters, or their values. So so these are some of them. Some of the other ones are actually being provided for. It's obvious in a healthy home, you don't feed one child and not feed another. And yet we do that in the family of America, and we do that in the family of a community. So let me think. So these are some of them. I think support, actually support to become your best self. And this is a big one. Because in the climate of our culture, and often in many of our homes, as well as our more collective culture, we only esteem certain things. It's important to become famous, or to become wealthy, or to have a lot of influence, or a lot of sex, or a lot of acquisition, or the best technologies. We don't often support people to actually be their essential self. Whatever that might be. It might be that a person doesn't have a big career striving. They just want to be a gardener in their own, to have their house and have a garden, or raise their children well. And these are all things that are equally important. So support for our essential drives. And I think one of the things that gets lost, and I talk quite a bit about all these things in my book, is that we actually depend on our differences. We depend on people having different strivings and different points of view. If one doctor, if it was only one way of looking at medicine, we'd probably miss a lot of our cures. Right? It takes a lot of different minds, a lot of different approaches to deal well with the things that we face as human beings. So these are some of the elements of a relatively healthy family. And one of the biggest ones, which I mentioned before, is a commitment to resolve conflict without hurting each other as much as humanly possible. But definitely without physical violence, without sexual violence, without ostracizing, without emotional, name calling and demeaning of one another. That commitment is huge. And we don't have that in the family of America. And of course we're suffering. And of course we're a dysfunctional family, because we still believe in war on whatever level.
Yeah, and that brings me to the next point is there seems to be a little bit of cognitive dissonance, and I see this more and more, at least for me anyway, because I get it from a spiritual practitioner that we don't want to be judgmental at all, right? And at the same time, for those of us who kind of know from our own experience that something is harmful and something is not, right? So it's to me it's balancing a commitment to truth with non-harming and kind of kindness, But if I have one part of me that says no, I shouldn't judge this, and the other part saying, oh well, that's harmful, you know what I'm saying? So there can be a disconnect. So the way I kind of resolve this is discernment, of course, right?
Yeah,
Commitment
right.
to non-harming, and just one of the ways. this teaching I've gotten that if I'm, and I've mentioned this so many times, I'll just mention it again, that if I'm looking at someone and then all of a sudden I think, oh no, I don't want to judge them, but the judgment's coming up, that's not necessarily judgment, I don't think, because there's a care and concern that I don't want to do that, right? It's only kind of judgment if I'm leveling something against someone and then I feel better about myself for like, putting them in their place, or that's judgmentalism, right? But if I'm saying, oh, I don't want, something just comes up, to me, that's like a recognition of like, okay, I see and honor your path, your divinity, your Buddha nature, or whatever. But that's just not for me right now. It's not like a really a value judgment so much. It's just that I'm just a recognition that I'm not, I choose something else than that. But it has to be done like, respectfully and not in a place where I'm putting them down and lifting myself up. So I think that's important to look at these things, because it can be a little bit, if somebody sees something that's clearly wrong, but they don't want to, not clearly wrong, I would say, harmful, there's
Harmful.
hurt, and we all know if we're being, I would say most of us know anyway, I would hope so, if we're being harmed or not, right? And then yeah, so and then abuse is never okay, so it's not something that we're being judgmental about, right? With abuse, it's usually, I guess there's some more gray areas, right? But there's some forms of things that are just harmful, and it's not a matter of judging or not, it's a matter of, and that's another reframing our way I look, instead of good or bad, that leads to judgments and things like that. It's like, what's helpful and what's not, especially in the long run. What's wise and what's not. What's skillful and what's not. So no matter if we see one person will see something as good, but another person will see it as bad, most of us can say, okay, well, something is skillful or it's not skillful. Something's wise or it's not. Something's helpful or it's not. So that way it's not, yeah. I think that's kind of the alternative to this. Do you see maybe where the disconnect I'm talking about here a little bit? Um, mm,
Absolutely. I
mm,
mean, absolutely. And it's interesting to you use exactly the word that I use. I don't think it's a disconnect. I think it really is two different things. I think discernment. If you go to a doctor and he tells you that your diet is really contributing to heart disease, that is not a judgment. That is a helpful diagnosis to help you stay alive in a healthy way. And it's no different with our psyches and our behavior. If we say beating your child is going to harm them irreparably for their life, they may become violent, they may become really passive and submissive out of fear, they may have failure to thrive, they may become the bully on the playground, they may become an addict out of their unrecognized and untreated pain. That is not a judgment. That is a diagnosis that is designed, and you said it really well, from a place of wanting to help and heal, not a place of wanting to condemn, shame, blame, or just overtly punish and retaliate. And I think that's the association we have with judgment, rather than judgment just being a tool of discernment for the purpose of helping.
it's a really important distinction, because yeah, we could easily one of these sides can become an extreme and then be used in the wrong manner, and then we forget that, and then yeah, so it's almost like being judgmental of being judgmental too. So right, so you just add another layer on top of it
Right.
as well. Yes. Okay. So, I mean, the roots of this, do you see any other, I mean, so I guess maybe we went over that, but the contributing factors, other contributing factors to where we are, and I don't want to point out of all that's wrong, and then we can look more towards therapies, but the understanding part of this, it just seems like, and again, this might sound judgmental, but I'm just kind of calling like I see it. When I look at the media landscape, that's a whole nother huge ball of wax, perhaps. Even just in the 90s before the internet came, I remember some of these sitcoms on TV, the way they depicted families, was just, I mean, kind of atrocious compared to like the wholesomeness of the 50s, but then that seems so fake and contrived, you
Right.
know? So if it's not one thing, it's another. And some people have even talked about, well, well, it's a little bit more dark, sinister thing that some people have claimed that they have planned to destabilize families because when people don't have a healthy family, then they're more reliant on the state and are things that they probably shouldn't be. So the people with a lot of money and power and a lot of standing, they, not all of them, but a lot of them really have strong family ties. And that's one of the reasons they've become so, I would say, maybe a condition that helped them become so successful and powerful. But at the same time, some people have a vested interest to break down a family support unit and to divide and conquer because then people are more easier to control as well. So I don't want to be pointing fingers so much, and I don't know if that's really the case or not. It just, when I look at reflections like of our families today, I really don't see any role models. Where do we look to? And you did really make a good point that there is nobody does this perfect, and of course that applies to everything. But as far as like a role model family, that
Right.
I think they're a lot few and far between. Yeah, and then what? How do you see it? And then what can we do about things like this?
Well, I don't think you have to worry about being judgmental. I think you're honestly and sincerely trying to be of help by looking truthfully and unafraid at what's actually in front of us. And I think that's part of actually being healthy. It's like being healthy is not being in denial of the pain and the suffering that we're actually witnessing and many of us are part of. So, I would just want to say that. I don't think you have to worry about being judgmental. The motivation here is how can we understand this, look it straight in the eye, and understand where the roots of violence and hatred and the atrocities that are being, perpetrated around the world, um, with wisdom, and then talk about what helps break the cycle. And I don't think there's any easy, quick fix, or we would have found it. I think it's a combination of educating ourselves about the roots of violence and the results of violence. So what you see by working with abusive families or people who have survived abuse is we see what the dynamics are, and a lot of them are being played out on large scales right around us. So abusers, to use what you were just saying, they want complete control because they can't exploit and hurt people if they don't have control over them. If people can run away or go get help or stand up for themselves effectively, then the abuser has lost all their power. So they're committed to keeping that control, keeping people dependent on them or so frightened of them, and sometimes actually paying them off in some way, rewarding them for complicity with the abuse. And I've seen that. I had a client whose parent who was abusing her rewarded her siblings for holding her down while he beat her you know. So, and we see this on a large scale. There are people who are definitely being rewarded for being complicit with abusive policies and practices. And so, again, it's really understanding what is this fabric of abuse and neglect made up of. And so, one of the things that I touched on when I talked about the victim crying for help is that when people are hurt by other people, and especially people close to them or people they depend on, and there's no help, and there's no escape, and there's no treatment, they are going to become symptomatic in some way. It might look okay. They might become a workaholic, and just go out in the world and blast through life. But chances are there's other symptoms like depression or high levels of anxiety or addiction or obsessiveness or becoming like really rigid and righteous and finding some defense system that helps them feel like they can survive. And we have to understand that their symptoms are their best way that they've come up with to survive the intolerable. And we have to stop judging that and really understand that just like if you have an infection in your body's not bad. It's fighting something that it's trying to, heal itself from in order to survive. And that's what our psychological symptoms are too. So go ahead. Yeah,
Oh yeah, it was going to say I guess maybe another dynamic of this is people shutting down. It's too much. They're
totally.
dealing with too much. They maybe would want it to go away, but they just can't bring themselves to face it and deal with it. It's too painful. Maybe people don't feel equipped to do it. Maybe they're not ready or it's not the right time as well. And so the can just keeps getting kicked down the road until it can
Right.
no longer be kicked down the road, I guess. So. Yeah, and anything about that dynamic, I guess.
Yeah, and so that's a big one. So, out of all the symptoms that I just mentioned, I often say, and I talk again about this quite in detail, is that there's two main symptoms that come out of untreated abuse in the family. And they are either identification with the aggressor, which means I adopt those survival mechanisms. I become the bully. I become the one who wants to dominate and get what I want, and don't care about the impact I have on other people. Or I'm so beaten down, I'm so frightened, I've learned to doubt myself, or I feel like I have no power, that I become what's called learned helplessness. I have learned helplessness. And you see this in adults. You see this in parents who stood by while their children were beaten or even killed by a partner. And we're like, what's wrong with these people? Why didn't they do something? Well, they froze. They actually froze out of an old pattern of learned helplessness that was deeply embedded in their psyche as a survival mechanism. And if you've ever spoken with anybody who's experienced that, you know that they might have, even in their head, wished they could move their body or open their mouth, and they can't. And that's a psychological condition that's a result of unhealed trauma. And we have to know that because we have more and more people going out into the adult world with learned helplessness or identification with the aggressor. And they're a perfect match for each other. And, I saw that, of course, a lot as a therapist, either in couples or in people describing their parents' relationship, where one was very dominating and the other was very submissive. Because a dominating person is going to look for someone who will submit.
Yeah, it's hand in glove. So I guess the other big thing, maybe in societal things going on now is this, on one hand, we have victim shaming. But on the other hand, we have people taking on victimhood as a badge of honor and like something very laudable, and that they want to be put on a pedestal for doing it as well. So I think these are kind of two extremes of what's going on with that. How do we kind of reconcile that? If I'm getting that map right there,
Yeah.
it's oversimplification, but I think you know what I'm talking about, perhaps. Yeah.
hmm Well, I think I'll start with victim shaming. I mean, I think that is part of the abuse cycle, is to shame people for calling out their victimization, when in fact it takes enormous courage and enormous strength to say, this happened to me and I want some kind of justice, I want help, I want protection. And so I think we really, and anyone who has gone to therapy, for instance, and sat there and opened up their heart and their body vibrating or shaking or their tears, can tell you how difficult it is to dive into that level of pain. So it really takes enormous courage. And there are people role modeling that, who are, some of our stars and celebrities have come out and told their stories, and I think that's a really healthy role model for people to know that, like, people who have gotten fame and wealth and notoriety can also say they've suffered from mental and emotional stress. Um, but victim shaming is part of perpetration. How do you keep your stronghold on your power? Is one of the ways of doing that is to demean and malign the person who calls out the truth. So we just have to know that is an abuse family dynamic for sure. Um, shaming and blaming and actually harming people for speaking up, which we do all. We do all of these things. The using victimization as sort of a badge of honor, I just think it's a young response to a healing process. I think I didn't run into a lot of that, or maybe even any of that in my practice. When I was working with people, I really felt like there was just a very sincere and deep and honest desire to heal and become their appropriate adult, empowered, expressive self in the world. So I think for people who may use that as a badge of distinction or a way to get attention, I think we who might understand that better have to look beyond that and really address the essential person in there that's still calling for help, because they're still calling for help.
Very well put. So the other thing that's coming up now is self-responsibility. Where does self-responsibility come into this too? When we're talking about, victim victimizer dynamics as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think self responsibility is fundamental of mental health. And, for some people it goes overboard and they feel like they're responsible for everything, and but self-responsibility for me is best acquired, and I'll be on that track for the rest of my life. I think it's a very powerful concept and important one to talk about, and I'm glad you brought it up. I think we take the best responsibility for ourselves when we've had a chance to heal, and we're not on automatic pilot in our reactivity and in having our wounds be triggered and becoming 2 or 5 in the way we relate to people. So the more a person has a chance to actually heal, the more they have access and choice to move into their adult self when they're in a situation that requires handling. They become responsible in a way that actually contributes to their own and other people's welfare. If that makes sense to you.
Yes, it does. And it is incredibly self-empowering too, to be responsible,
Absolutely.
self-responsible. Absolutely. Um,
Mm.
So, Phyllis, I start winding down here. Thank you for joining me today. The book's America in Therapy, and tell people how they can get it. Paper copies or whatever, and your
Right.
website. If you have any other books going on, any other writing engagements, I don't know, events, whatever
Yeah.
else you have in the pipeline that you would like to share with people, and then anything else you'd like to draw people's attention to as we draw this to a close.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me and giving me a chance to share what I'm passionate about. And it's also always wonderful to talk with someone who's sort of on the same wavelength. you know. My website is www.phyllislevitt.com, and you can buy my book, American Therapy, on my website, but it's also available from all major booksellers: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, Goodreads. You can find it anywhere. Um, I'm on all social media, Facebook and LinkedIn, and I have articles on Substack. And on my website, I have um, interviews I've done, I have blogs, I have information about my background, and I also have some information about the 2 previous books I wrote, which are really much more about my own healing journey and my own spiritual journey. And those 2 books are A Light in the Darkness and Into the Fire, and they're also available from all major booksellers, and you can look them up on my website. And you can contact me through my website if you have questions, if you want to talk further. And I'm happy to connect with anybody that connects with me. And I also have some free offerings that are available um, through my website. So I'm happy to connect with anyone and everyone. And the last thing I want to say is we all matter and we can all make a difference.
Well, beautiful words of wisdom there and very heartfelt too. So with that, may all beings everywhere come to know their highest, or I would just say most helpful forms of therapy, for ourselves, for each other, and I think probably now more than a lot of other times for America too, and which goes in trickles into the larger world. So in that, and may all beings everywhere realize awakening and be freed.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.